There are moments in history when something is observed, documented, and never fully explained. Not rumors, not campfire stories, but events recorded in official reports, newspaper headlines, and military briefings. Casefile Unknown is an investigative archive of those moments. Each episode examines a documented anomalous event. Military encounters, civilian reports, government programs, and phenomena that entered the historical record without clear resolution. We do not begin with belief. We do not begin with dismissal. We begin with documentation. Dates, witnesses, context. We separate confirmed record from later embellishment. We follow the timeline. We examine competing explanations, and we identify what remains unresolved. Tonight, we open the first file. But we do not begin with Roswell. We do not begin with abductions. We do not begin with modern congressional hearings. We begin during war. Winter, 1944. The Second World War was entering its final and most desperate phase in Europe. Allied bombers crossed into hostile airspace under darkness. Night fighter crews patrolled skies illuminated only by instrument panels and distant searchlights. Radar was evolving, jet aircraft were emerging, experimental weapons were rumored on both sides. The air war had become a laboratory of uncertainty, and in that environment, trained military crews began reporting lights, small luminous objects, orange, red, occasionally white. They were seen pacing aircraft at high speed, hovering near wingtips, executing controlled maneuvers, not attacking, not falling behind, simply remaining. These reports did not come from civilians. They came from combat airmen operating in active war zones. Within weeks, the phenomenon reached the press. In January 1945, newspapers printed a name, Foo Fighters. The term would echo for decades, but what was actually reported? What was documented? What did military intelligence conclude? And what explanations were proposed then and later? This is Case File 001, the Foo Fighters. We follow the record and we examine what remains unknown. To understand the Foo Fighters reports, we first need to understand the environment in which they occurred. December 1944. The European theater of World War II was entering its final winter. Allied forces had crossed into German territory. The Battle of the Bulge was underway. The air war had intensified dramatically. Night fighter operations were among the most dangerous assignments in the conflict. Pilots flew in near total darkness. Weather conditions were unpredictable. Anti-aircraft fire illuminated the sky in violent bursts. Enemy aircraft were increasingly advanced, including early jet fighters and experimental weapons. Radar technology existed, but it was still developing. Airborne interception radar allowed night fighters to locate enemy aircraft in darkness, but it was far from perfect. Ground clutter, atmospheric interference, electrical anomalies. Operators relied on interpretation as much as instrumentation. This was an environment filled with uncertainty. It was also an environment saturated with new technology. The German military was deploying advanced weapon systems including the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Rumors circulated among Allied crews of secret experimental devices. Within this climate, reports of unusual aerial phenomena carried immediate tactical significance. If enemy aircraft were using new forms of propulsion or guidance, night fighter crews needed to know. This context matters, because when the first reports of luminous objects appeared, they were not treated as folklore. They were treated as potential threats. And it was within this environment that something unexpected began to appear. To understand the first reports of the so-called Foo Fighters, we have to begin with the men who encountered them. In late 1944, American night fighter crews were flying some of the most dangerous missions of the war. Their job was to patrol the skies over Western Europe after dark, intercepting German bombers and reconnaissance aircraft that attempted to move under cover of night. One of the units assigned to these missions was the 415th Night Fighter Squadron of the United States Army Air Forces. Operating primarily over the Rhine Valley in the border in between France and Germany, these crews flew specialized aircraft equipped with airborne radar. Each plane carried 2 crew members, a pilot and a radar operator, working together to detect and intercept enemy aircraft in total darkness. Because of this equipment and training, night fighter crews were among the most experienced observers in the air war. And it was these crews who first began reporting something unusual. One of the earliest widely documented sightings occurred during a patrol in November 1944. On board the aircraft were Lieutenant Edward Schluter, the pilot, and Lieutenant Donald Myers, the radar operator. Also involved in documenting the event was Lieutenant Fred Ringwald, the squadron's intelligence officer. During the mission, the crew observed a group of bright lights approaching the aircraft. According to the report, the objects appeared as 8 to 10 glowing orange spheres in the distance. The lights moved rapidly toward the aircraft and then began pacing it, maintaining a steady position relative to the plane. Radar operator Donald Myers checked the onboard radar equipment, expecting to see an approaching aircraft, but the radar screen showed nothing. No contact, no signal, no indication that another aircraft was nearby. After several moments, the lights abruptly broke away and disappeared. Over the following weeks, similar encounters continued to occur. Another patrol in December 1944, flown near the Rhine River region, reported a single bright red light moving through the night sky. The object was described as several times brighter than a star and appeared to be traveling at roughly 200 miles per hour. The pilot attempted to close the distance within the object, but the light suddenly vanished before an interception could occur, once again, radar equipment detecting nothing. One of the most detailed reports occurred near Agno, France, later in December 1944. During a night patrol, pilot Lieutenant David McFalls and radar operator Lieutenant Edward Baker observed two glowing lights rising rapidly from the ground. The objects climbed until they reached the same altitude as the aircraft and then positioned themselves behind the plane. McFalls later reported that the lights appeared to maintain formation with the aircraft for nearly 2 minutes. They followed the aircraft through turns and changes in speed, behaving in a way that suggested controlled flight. Then, without warning, the lights descended and disappeared into the darkness below. Once again, radar equipment detected no aircraft in the area. As reports like these accumulated, crews began discussing the sightings during mission briefings and debriefings. Radar operator Donald Myers eventually began referring to the mysterious lights by a nickname drawn from a popular comic strip of the time. In the comic Smokey Stover, the phrase, "Where there's foo, there's fire," appeared frequently. The name stuck. Among the pilots of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, the strange lights were now known simply as Foo Fighters. By the end of December 1944, the phenomenon was no longer considered an isolated incident. Multiple crews within the squadron had reported seeing similar lights during night patrols over the same region. The objects appeared without warning, maneuvered alongside aircraft, and then vanished just as quickly. They showed no radar signature and never engaged the aircraft directly, but their presence was persistent enough that intelligence officers began compiling formal reports of the encounters. Within weeks, the mysterious sightings would spread beyond the squadron itself. Reports of strange lights began reaching Allied intelligence offices, and eventually the press. And as the story spread, the question facing investigators became increasingly difficult to answer. What exactly were the Foo Fighters? By early 1945, the mysterious lights were no longer just rumors among pilots. They were now appearing in official intelligence reports, mission logs, and even major newspapers. One of the earliest public reports came from January 2, 1945, when an Associated Press article described American night fighter pilots encountering what they believed could be a new Nazi secret weapon. Pilots reported balls of fire flying alongside their aircraft, matching speeds of over 300 miles per hour. Lieutenant Donald Myers described 3 distinct types: red fireballs that hovered near the wingtips, vertical rows of glowing lights appearing in front of the aircraft, and distant clusters of flickering lights that looked, in his words, like a Christmas tree in the sky. In one incident, Myers said a glowing object followed his aircraft for 20 miles down the Rhine Valley. When he turned right, the lights turned with him. When he turned left, they followed again. He even dove at 360 miles per hour, but the objects kept pace before suddenly shooting upward and disappearing. Despite these encounters, no aircraft were ever damaged. The objects never attacked. They simply followed. But these sightings didn't stop at pilot testimony. They began appearing inside classified military communications. A War Department message dated January 2, 1945, sent from U.S. Army intelligence to Allied headquarters in France, asked for an explanation regarding the mysterious lights. The message read, "Press reports describe red balls of fire accompanying aircraft in flight, termed Foo Fighters, by air personnel. Explanation requested if available." At this point, even military intelligence wanted answers. Soon after the 415th Night Fighter Squadron submitted its own internal report, the document described crews being followed by lights that blinked, changed colors, and flew in formation with their aircraft. The pilots wrote that the lights were agitating and unsettling, mainly because no one could explain them. The report ended with a simple request: more information was needed. Detailed mission logs from December 1944 and January 1945 confirmed multiple encounters. Pilots described lights rising from the ground and climbing to their altitude, objects following their aircraft for several minutes, glowing spheres hovering behind their tail at distances of roughly 1,000 feet, and lights that suddenly accelerated upward and vanished. In every case, pilots contacted ground radar control to check if the enemy aircraft were nearby. The answers were always the same: no aircraft detected. By mid-February 1945, the mystery had reached the desk of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Their official response was simple: they had no explanation. The phenomenon was forwarded to technical intelligence specialists for further investigation. Even the British Air Ministry examined the reports. Their conclusion? Some sightings might have been jet aircraft or flak rockets, but they admitted that the evidence was too inconsistent to reach a definitive answer. The investigation continued even after the war ended. In October 1945, U.S. Air Force intelligence interviewed captured German scientists and military engineers to determine whether the phenomenon had been a secret Nazi weapon. The results were surprising. None of the German officials had ever heard of such a device. Experts from rocket programs, missile development, and command all stated the same thing. Germany had never developed anything resembling the balls of fire described by Allied pilots, which left investigators with the final conclusion: the phenomenon was real enough to be documented by pilots, intelligence officers, and multiple Allied commands, but its true origin remained completely unknown. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, the sightings didn't stop in Europe. Reports of this same mysterious light soon began appearing in the Pacific theater as well. Decades after the war ended, the Foo Fighters sightings continued to attract the attention of researchers interested in unexplained aerial encounters reported by pilots. One of the most notable investigators was Dr. Richard F. Haynes. Haynes was not a journalist or UFO enthusiast. He was a research scientist at NASA's Ames Research Center, where he specialized in human visual perception and aviation safety. During his career, Haynes became increasingly interested in reports from professional pilots who described encounters with unexplained objects while in flight. Unlike many UFO researchers, Haynes approached the subject from an aviation science perspective. He believed that encounters reported by trained pilots deserved careful documentation and technical analysis, especially if they involved aircraft operating in controlled airspace. Over several decades, Haynes collected and studied thousands of aviation-related UAP reports. These included encounters reported by military pilots, commercial airline crews, and radar operators. His research examined factors such as flight conditions, radar data, pilot testimony, and environmental effects that might explain what witnesses observed. The body of material he assembled eventually grew into an extensive archive. Today, the Richard F. Haynes collection contains more than 20 boxes of research files, including pilot interviews, photographs, radar analysis, technical papers, and historical documents related to unexplained aerial phenomena. Among those files are records connected to the World War II Foo Fighter sightings. Haynes examined these wartime encounters alongside modern aviation reports in order to determine whether similar patterns could be found across different decades. In several of his publications, he noted that the Foo Fighter reports shared characteristics with many later pilot encounters, including luminous objects that paced aircraft, performed controlled maneuvers, and often left little or no radar evidence behind. For Haynes, the significance of the Foo Fighter case was not simply that the sightings occurred during wartime. It was that they represented some of the earliest documented examples of professional pilots reporting unexplained aerial phenomena while on active missions. And because those reports were recorded in mission logs, intelligence summaries, and military communications, they remain an important part of the historical record surrounding unexplained encounters in aviation. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the phenomenon known as Foo Fighters had been reported by numerous Allied air crews across two separate theaters of war. Night fighter pilots flying over Western Europe had encountered glowing spheres pacing their aircraft. Bomber crews operating thousands of miles away in the Pacific described similar lights appearing during long-range missions. In many cases, the objects matched the speed and maneuvering of military aircraft before suddenly disappearing. Despite repeated sightings, the phenomenon remained difficult to investigate. The objects rarely appeared on radar, left no physical evidence, and never engaged the aircraft directly, but the consistency of the reports was difficult to ignore. These observations were made by trained military pilots and radar operators, many of whom had thousands of hours of flight experience, and their accounts were recorded in mission logs, intelligence summaries, and wartime reports. Over the years, several explanations have been proposed. Some researchers believe the sightings may have been caused by natural atmospheric phenomena, such as ball lightning or electrical discharges that occasionally form during storms. Others suggest the lights may have been a form of St. Elmo's fire, an electrical glow that can sometimes appear around aircraft flying through charged air. Another possibility is that pilots were observing enemy weapons or experimental aircraft. But after the war ended, Allied investigators interviewed German engineers and military officials who had worked on advanced weapons programs. None reported developing any technology that matched the descriptions given by Allied pilots. A final explanation often considered by historians is that the sightings may have resulted from visual misidentifications, optical illusions, or stress experienced during combat missions. Night flying during wartime conditions was extremely demanding, and unusual lights in the sky could easily lead to confusion. Yet this explanation does not fully account for the number of separate reports, or the similarity between sightings recorded by different crews. Although the Foo Fighters sightings eventually faded from military reports after the war ended, the mystery did not disappear entirely. In fact, the case would become one of the earliest modern examples of what would later be called unidentified flying objects. Just 2 years later, in 1947, pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing a formation of unusual objects near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His description of the movement gave rise to a new term that would dominate headlines for decades: flying saucers. And with that report, public interest in unexplained aerial phenomena would explode across the United States. But the Foo Fighters remained an earlier chapter in that story, a mystery reported by wartime pilots, recorded in official documents, and never fully explained. This has been Casefile 001, the Foo Fighters. More cases coming.